Gentlemen, the time has come once again to discuss things.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Geeky Gentleman History Month, the month in which we discuss the contributions the geeky gentlemen have made to history, but that have been ignored by biased educational system. I, as always, am Sid Part 2. Joining me today is...
the ever arrogant and courteous, a geek for fun.
Indeed. And this might be one of our last episodes... Oh no, this is very much one of our last episodes of History Month. My apologies for missing last week. Just shit could not come together. And I was too lazy to do anything about it. I'm a terrible, terrible YouTuber. But really, it's all Alfie's fault.
Yes, and I will take full responsibility, for it is what I, in the history books, you shall proclaim as the one who stole History Month.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyway, so today we're going to do a topic that I think I've had this topic kind of in my back pocket for like the last 2 or 3 Geeky Gentleman History Months, and I just never get around to it because I'm like, oh no, I want to discuss this instead. This is a much better topic. But this is still good. This is not the filler of Geeky Gentleman History Month topics, I promise. We do top 10 lists so very rarely, so I thought it'd be fun to do a top 10 list during History Month and discuss our top 10 technologies. Now, this is, of course, based solely on personal opinion, personal belief. This is not a official ranking of the best technologies ever developed in human history. It's just technologies that exist that we feel strongly about for one reason or another. And for those of you that don't know how Geeky Gentleman top 10 lists go, we're not both going to go through 10 because, frankly, that's exhausting. We each got 5, and so this is the collective will of Geeky Gentleman's top 10 technological advancements in history. Alfie, do you want to go first, or should I?
You go first, just because, again, being this is your topic, I kind of want to gauge how to approach this from how you do.
Oh no, that's a terrible sentence, because now I don't know how to approach it. Okay, so my first one, my number 5 rather, is... It's one of those things where I don't really have much of a sense for why I think it's really important or anything, but it's just... I feel like it gets to a very particularly human thing that I thought would be interesting to bring up. And that is the invention of flight. Aircraft, helicopters, all that kind of stuff. Human flight is something I find really interesting because there are stories about it going back about as far as you can go back, about humans taking to the air like birds. You've got the imagery of angels, you've got stories about it with the Greek gods, you got Icarus and yada yada yada. There's just all this great wealth of stories about flying, and it took a really long time to get there, which is something I find really, really interesting because it kind of goes to that idea of that always grasping, always reaching for more, always trying to push the limits, and it's all based on human ingenuity. And that's something that, it's one of the few things when we, as much as we talk about history on this, during this month in Geeky Gentleman, it can get really dour. It can get really, and then this genocide happened, and it sucked, and that's why humans suck. That's basically every other episode of Geeky Gentleman History Month. But for real, there are there are things about studying history that I find fascinating, and one of those things is always that very human urge to kind of just push beyond and just keep going. And flight is, I think, one of those really good examples of that, where it's just it's kind of the ultimate, you're not meant to do it, but yet we do it. And like, I don't know, it's also really fascinating to just look at the way the technology has evolved, because technically speaking, the first human flight would be balloons, hot air balloons, because those date back to like the 1700s, but they were pretty sparingly used, or maybe even 1600s. They're pretty sparingly used. But then you get into like the Wright brothers with basically just what are, by today's standards, gliders, and that quickly, as soon as the principles of that got figured out, you very quickly get into, you know, engineered propeller-based flight, and then the jet engine breakthroughs in the late 40s. Funny enough, Hitler and the Luftwaffe were the first military to develop jet engine flight, and if they cracked it earlier in the war, would have been one of those things that just completely shifted the balance of power. But, you know, just the jet engine flight, and then just commercial flight is also really fucking fascinating. And, of course, that leads very quickly into space flight, which just very quickly leads into, you know, sci-fi, Star Trek, all that stuff. It's a really cool little window to that very positive, kind of rosy glasses of the march of human progress, and that's why I put it at my number 5. I really like it as just a symbol, if nothing else.
Yeah, so I put this on my list as well, a little bit higher. I just had like planes in general, but overall flight. I think that's a really good summation of where I stand with it as well, because again, you just look at it from like a primal hindbrain kind of mentality, right? The idea of you can swim. Most things can swim, most things can touch water. They might drown, but there's like a connection there, right? There's like a physical, I can touch this, I can feel what it's like to be in this. You don't know how it is like to fly, but you're just close enough when you jump, or you jump from something higher, you can taste it. You can imagine how it would feel. It's a lot different when you see like in other more recent times, and like in terms of just like, okay, how would it feel like to be this? Whenever people imagine how would it feel like to be like a bolt of electricity, if I could go into like the internet or something like that, that's a much more ethereal, modern invention. The idea of flight is something that's not just a human thing, but a lot of other animals have designed and evolved ways to achieve it, even though their species naturally shouldn't be able to do that. Like, overall, it's such an ingenious, crazy, unique, I guess, just advantage, because you look at it from that stance. Okay, the idea of flight gives you tactical advantage because you get to be in a perspective away from danger, but you can see everything around it in a way that your environment completely transforms. And then you apply that to modern technology, where now we can see countries and landscapes from above. You get amazing tracking shots now of like drones going across rainforests, and it's just crazy to see something from like, or even just drones going through a city. And it completely changes the perspective of what that city would look like if you're down on the ground walking through it, and you get to maybe in like a trashy like New York, it's there's dirt everywhere and everything. It looks gorgeous like when it's from like that angle. I think that particularly sparked something in the imagination that really did just kind of get the race to do it, and we've kind of stopped, which is a sad thing. But there was a period where it was like a very, maybe more than anything else except for like weapons technology, and even that kind of plateaued once you got to the bomb. But it was such a forward, like, okay, we got from this to this to this, and now we're building rockets, we're going to space, like that kind of like constant one-upmanship, in a way that got very toxic when it basically became a metaphor of, okay, which country's got the bigger dick. But the idea of it actually being a competitive drive to see who can figure out this basic idea better than the other person, and then once that's done, people can take that blueprint and then build on it. And that's like a theme I'm probably going to get into a lot, but I think Flight being maybe the opener of that is such a perfect example.
Okay, cool. Now,
Do you have any specifically favorite models of aircraft?
Oh, I don't know if I get that specific with it again. Like, that's kind of why it's so low on my list, is it's one of those things where the idea of it is much more fascinating to me than anything about the particulars. Like, the mathematics of it, all that stuff, doesn't interest me as much as just the act of it, you know?
I was just curious if you did, because, I mean, if I have no idea, like, specific model names and stuff like that, but just in terms of, like, archetypal stuff, I really, despite how awful they are and how they will kill everyone, I really do like blimps and, like, airships. They look cool to me. That's an aesthetic.
Airships are an aesthetic. I do like the look of those. I guess I'm more interested in kind of the cutting edge stuff. Like, I know the U.S. military, God, we give them way too much money for shit like this. But, like, they're developing jets now that can take off and do a direct vertical landing and takeoff. Basically, the like jet engine just can turn 90 degrees and allow it to achieve liftoff from the ground or land just straight vertically like a helicopter would. And it's really cool. The thing burns through fuel in like 10 minutes, and that's just... and then it's just over. But it's a really fucking cool thing to just see, and it's one of those things that just feels a little sci-fi though. So I don't know.
Of course, out of everything I named, the Green Lantern fan names the jet.
I mean, yeah, you know, jets are cool.
Jets are cool. All right. My one after that though, I guess I'll save one which is a little bit more repetitive. Because we kind of picked on, not really got an order to these because I think so many of them are just subjective. But in terms of like, okay, we talked about military. I'm curious about you because I was still hesitant to put this on, but I'm kind of firm in my stance. This is the only weapon I've got on the list. Other things like flight and other stuff could be turned into weapons, but this is the one that's specifically made for harm. And I'll maybe get into why I still think it's a valuable bit of technology, and that is the sword.
Interesting.
Now, the sword, throughout at least early history, well, really all of its history, because even now, the swords became outdated a long, long time ago. After that point, they became entirely ceremonial. To this day, it's just like a novelty kind of thing, right? But even back in their most basic earlier times, if you look at it from the East or the West, the sword was kind of given this unique status among other weapons. You'll have like the poorer people in Japan using farming tools and stuff to be able to fight back. That's where you get like sai from. So there are always been like improvised ways to kill someone, but the idea of the sword was much more of like a craft. And if you go to like in English history, the idea of your father would most likely be a knight, and that's how you would be trained to be a knight, and how he specifically used the sword would be passed down to you, and that would be in your family as kind of thing. And that really interests me, this kind of like legacy of the weapon. Obviously in fiction it's all been blown up, because I can entirely see why it has been, because first of all the things look really cool. Secondly, they're given such artistic way, especially in how like they're crafted compared to nearly every other form of weapon. I think they have like a special kind of vibe to me that makes me appreciate them over every other single type of killing weapon.
I think you're really onto something. There's, you know, like a bunch of other weapons are... They have a utility outside of combat. You know, there are, like the invention of a spear for example. Of course, it's a very useful weapon. It's a very practical, very quick weapon. You put a pointy thing on the end of a long stick, and then you can stab a guy from further away. It's a very simple thing to make into a weapon. But it's also more than likely from a practical place. You can fish with a spear. You can hunt with a spear. A spear isn't only meant to kill another person. Same with a bow. Same with a sling. All these other things, they were certainly used in warfare, in ancient warfare, but they had uses outside of that. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I'm trying to think of other things that aren't just a killing weapon like a sword is. Okay, like a mace.
Yeah. Like, bondelers, or like anything that's meant to. Even then, that kind of falls into more like that's also used as like a torture device.
What's a bondola?
It's like those like free little spiky maces at the end of a spinning chain.
Yeah, and I mean what's interesting about those, of course, is their weapons designed much later in the game, obviously, but their weapons designed in some ways to combat armor, shields, and again in particular swords. Their weapons designed to kind of get around, like the thing with a mace, because even a club, like when we talk mace, we're talking on a chain kind of thing. The idea of a mace is you can swing it and it can wrap around and break, or at least grapple and remove the sword from the equation, right? Like, sword-on-sword combat is clashes and clangs constantly, whereas a mace will allow you to rip the weapon out of your opponent's hand. And so it's really useful, but, like, still, it's a reaction to a sword. A sword is very particularly a true weapon of combat. It's doesn't have any other use, which is really fascinating. Like,
especially because like you have to. Obviously, every other weapon can have this level attributed to it, but there are also like cheats or ways for less privileged people in the regime to be able to get their hands on like makeshift versions of these weapons. Like the bow and arrow is an easy example. You can have very finely crafted archery scats, but then you can also just make one out of sticks and a bit of so there's like different levels. You can't really cheap a sword. You can make cheaply built swords, but they still have to be made and crafted from a certain thing. Which I think, again, adds to that almost ritualistic aspect of it. Obviously, through fiction, because the sword is a very phallic weapon, it's been given mostly to, like, the chivalric knights kind of idea, or even the samurai, and it's like this attached to manhood kind of idea. And throughout history, that is kind of interesting to examine, just in how it really did become the representation of a lot of these people's lives on this single weapon. I don't think has ever been matched. You'll get a lot of modern military people who very much like fetishize guns, right? And that's given somewhat of that weight, especially when people call in question should people be allowed to have guns. People like to say it's like a personal thing for like the amendments and all of that. But the sword, more so than that even, was respected from like even the higher points of like society. Like it wasn't just a thing the lower class were using to protect their ideals, or that only soldiers were sent off. Kings would have swords as like they would be purely decorative, but it was a sign of power.
Yeah, and then of course in Western culture, you talk about the design. You look at like Roman swords and Greek swords and stuff, and they use like short stabbing swords. And then as combat kind of shifted up into Europe, and you've got like just a very different style of combat, it begins to take a different shape and become more of a slashing weapon, but in particular in that, a katana is a slashing weapon. A European broadsword very quickly begins to mirror the imagery of a cross. Like, that is one of my favorite things to always see is like Renaissance art and stuff where they mirror the sword as a cross. And it's like the most non-Christian thing in the world, but it's always like such a cool like visual thing that makes those kinds of swords very distinct. Yeah, I don't know. It's really fascinating. It's got a very profound cultural impact. I think you're very right.
That's basically what I fall down on. I think maybe in modern day as well, just kind of like talk about beyond the historical thing. I think I'm really admiring how swords have kind of become the best versions of themselves lately, where because no one's using them in actual combat, you see a lot of like recreational battles or just admiring the craftsmanship and preserving those specific ways of how swords were built and passing that down through families without the intention of ever using them, but just because it's become almost an art form in that respect. You get people who collect swords, you get people who make their own swords, you get every single video game or fantasy world or every single fictional universe in the world, basically. You'd be hard-pressed to find one that doesn't have some variant of a cool sword design. Mm-hmm. It's become a very unique being unto itself that I really just am endlessly fascinated by.
Absolutely. All right. Go ahead and move on to my number 4, and I did rank these based on my own personal perception of importance. So, yeah, you got that.
Have to debunk.
Yeah. So my number 4 is the printing press. It's one of those things where like I feel a lot of people kind of almost forget it's an invention sometimes. Books used to have to be rewritten out by hand. Like that's what monks just used to do, was write Bibles all day, every day. You just would transcribe. And so for works other than the Bible to be able to be copied and disseminated to the masses was exceptionally rare. There were other things that were kept around, but really no. There'd be personal libraries where if you were rich enough you could afford to have someone, transcribe other works, but it was mainly the Bible, and as far as Western culture goes. So then there comes around the invention of the printing press, and I think it kind of shows a very clear turning point in human history. Because the printing press kind of... It becomes your precursor to mass media. It becomes the precursor to a lot of different things, and it does a lot of different things. What is something that you now know is not true, but when you were younger you believed it was, and also your family believed it, and may still?
The royal family is good.
I was gonna go for something less subjective. I don't know. It gets hard, but like the reason that you have a lot of, I think, superstition among people, like the idea of like the old superstitious town or village or whatever, is because a lot of things are just taken at face value and there's not really information on it. As much as oral tradition is important, it has a tendency to pass down misconceptions and misconstructions of events, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the printing press circumvents that. The printing press allows for sourcing in academia. It allows for, just a new kind of like everybody's reading the same book now. Everybody's doing everything the same, or getting all the information in the same way now. So you get not only works of fiction being produced, but then you start to get works of academia being produced and disseminated because of the printing press in a way that just wouldn't have happened before. Even like the great library projects throughout history have always been like, at best. Like Library of Alexandria, like infamously burned down. Funny enough, one of the only reasons we have a lot of the ancient Greek philosopher stuff now is because of Islamic libraries keeping it on scrolls. And so it's just, that became less of a thing. Now when something, or not even now, obviously now, but since the invention of the printing press, sourcing for these things, it's much less likely after the printing press for information just be completely lost to time. And that's something that's just, it's really, really important, I think, for human development and for like the collective growing intelligence. You kind of, one of the most ignorant ass arguments that always pisses me off is like, oh, what good does public education do for me? I'm not planning to have kids. Why should I have to pay for public school? And I'm like, anytime I hear someone say it, my reaction is just, did you drive anywhere today? Yes. Did you go over a bridge? Yes. There you go. Like that's kind of all you need is like the goods of public education. And so it's just the printing press is instrumental in that, and of course it's instrumental in preservation of fantastic works of literature for centuries now. It's just a very, very profoundly important piece of technology, I feel.
I mean, I think that can't get understated just how much the ideas being not just widely accessible, but as things improved and it became a market, but information being cheap. The price and power of information cannot be understated of how much knowing something meant you could be more powerful than some kings. Just if you had them at right time, because things were so completely, you were very lucky if you knew anything. Basically, you had to seek out, and if you had to seek out, that could be your entire life's mission doing that, and then you'll never be able to share that, just because, not just talking about people around the world, people in your town might never be able to, like that kind of level of not being able to share information and the information being hoarded. It led to different places and people rising up in power simply because they knew more than other people and being able to do that. Obviously that still happens. Whenever we make a system, people are going to be able to cheat and manipulate that system. But I do feel like, despite how much misinformation goes around, being able to have widespread, relatively fast information, I'm not specifically talking about the internet, I'm talking pre-internet days, information to a wider public, not only improved general awareness of how the world works, but also meant that the people could then call that shit out more in a larger mass. Because before, you'll have people point out flaws or they see things they don't agree with, and you could just execute them, right? Like, you'd never have to listen to that one person again or that one group again. The moment something's in the paper and it's being read all over the country, then you do kind of have to deal with that. And I think that really changed most specifically how the world is governed, and how leaders are I think it had a massive impact in how it kind of de-religified leaders, specifically in, at least I know in English history, kings and queens and the royal family still have that kind of weight to a lot of people in the UK, just like of that national pride. But before the widespread form of information, it was mostly seen as like an almost kind of, oh, well, that's just the way a thing is, that's like a god. You're never going to actually meet them or even hear of them. You just know the name king, and it kind of has a weight to it, right? Or even over to the emperors kind of deal. Pharaoh is like, you don't have that kind of, this is a real thing, because you've only ever heard people talk about it. You've only ever heard whispers or campfire stories and stuff like that from people who may have not actually heard of those. They could just be rumors. Once that information is serialized, and it could be wrong information, I think the important thing is that everyone has the same information, that even if it's wrong, people can use that as a basis and then debunk it on their own through having that. Does that make any sense?
No, like even if it's wrong, everyone's looking at the same thing. That's why I kind of talked about sourcing is, before sourcing, it's like, oh, even, all right, you could source with like, when books were still hand transcribed, you could still source information, but like there's immediately less of a reliability to that, because what if it's a transcription error? It's hilarious how like that, you can't 100% disprove it, because your version of this text may be just a little different, or it could be wildly different than someone else's. Like, you could be dealing with two completely different translations of the same text that have been just transcribed by two completely different people, and so you're getting like 4 or 5 steps away from the original source. So even if you're sourcing information and the information is wrong, it still has a source. It's easier to trace it back to why it's wrong than things just having to be taken on face value.
And I think that's kind of where I didn't put it on my list, but I definitely 100% agree with the merits of it. Basically, just because it really changed humanity in that sense of really, for the first time, making larger communities who still never have to meet or talk to each other, but because humans are wired a certain way, you send the same paper to like all across one country, you're gonna get hundreds of thousands of people with the exact same opinions on that piece if they never meet. Because there's only a certain amount of ways people can kind of be wired. Everyone's individual, but like people have inclinations and such, especially when the amount of stimulus from outside sources back then was so little and minimal, where everyone was basically dealing with the same shit. So that's how movements are formed, that's how revolutions are formed. The news is such a powerful tool when in the right hands. Again, this is the Superman fanboy time. You want to hype up the jet, I'll hype up the newspaper. I think it's one of those things where it is being able to get that out. I'm so thankful it happened, because it very easily couldn't have. And maybe, I don't think a lot of people in power understood just how bad it was going to get for them now that they didn't have such a tight grip on the control of information. I'm very happy that happened then. Kind of wish that would continue to happen now. But that kind of sense, I feel, is very important to human history.
All right, what's your next one, sir?
My next one is kind of similar to the idea of linking the world together in the first Strand game, Hideo Kojima. So basically, I'm going for something I use a lot more frequently than I used to, and I've kind of grown a really personal appreciation for it, and that is trains. Specifically railways, to move away from more transportation terms. I don't know how familiar you are with like just using trains, or you use them in the past or at all.
I think I've been on. I went on the New York City subway when I went to New York, and I think I've been on one train to Chicago, and that was it.
How was your experience with those?
I was like 16 on the subway of New York, and I'm pretty sure that was just from the like it was a hell of a commute. It was truly the New York experience. We got off the plane, we got onto a shuttle. It took us to a subway station. We rode for like 5 minutes. We got off the subway. We got onto a bus. We got to our hotel. It was truly the most New Yorker experience I could possibly imagine. But yeah, so like subway was like nothing, and then the train experience for the trip to Chicago. The only thing you could have laughed. The only thing I remember about it, and the only reason I'm able to place it, is the fact that I had a Jar Jar Binks toy and I was playing with it. So this would have had to be either just after or just before the Phantom Menace released. So I'd have been 9, maybe even 8. That's all I remember about that train trip, is playing with my Jar Jar Binks toy and something else, and my brother making fun of me, and my mom saying, "At least he's not bothering anyone." And that's the whole thing, my whole memory.
When are we gonna get that on March t-shirts?
Yeah.
At least I'm not bothering anyone with a Jar Jar Binks picture. I think that's more cutting than people might imagine. That's interesting because
I mean, like, that's just geography for me. I'm in Fort fucking Wayne, Indiana. You know what we have here? Corn. We don't have a purpose for trains. Everyone needs a car. Everyone's house is 20 minutes away from their work. There's no reason for a train. We barely have a fucking bus schedule functioning in this city.
I mean, that's entirely fair enough. I won't hold it against Fort Wayne specifically, but I think strangely it is such a British thing, right? The train journey. For some reason, it's kind of become more synonymous with like the fact that we've talked about this on the previous episode. You could do an entire fan film in Harry Potter on a train.
Yeah.
The fact that it's so part of that culture of, and how I specifically like it is, because I can't cheaply, regularly go on a plane and have no reason to. Because I can't cheaply and reasonably use something I have else on the list that we might get to later on this ball. But I can use a train regularly, relatively cheaply, and over long distances. It lets me appreciate and see more of where I live than I had before. And this has gone on for, because I've been going on many train journeys with me and my mum. We would like travel a lot, go down to Devon, which is near the coast, and then when I got older, I just doing more train journeys to go and see friends, or now I'm going on train journeys to go study and stuff. So I've always kind of been used to them, and they give me like a cozy feeling, because when you get on a train that isn't, because it can go horribly wrong. I've been in the London Underground, which I'm sure isn't as bad as the New York one, but it is still kind of like, eesh. But that kind of feeling of when you're super crowded and there's no room and everything, that's not what I'm there for. That's not nice, and that can easily ruin the experience for me. But what I really like is when you're on like it's like midday or something, and it's on like a weekend, so no one's really at work, and who is at work are going to be like keeping to themselves and stuff, and you're almost in like an empty train, almost to yourself, and you're just sitting down. I normally have music on or something, and you can just look out the window. And I don't know, man, it's such a surreal experience to me. I don't know if anyone listens to this has stuff like that, but it's one of the real moments of like true, like almost like a zen state of like relaxation, of just like, because you don't get to see how beautiful like countryside is when you're going like a motorway, or when you're going like really fast, because like at that point you're too busy like focusing on the road, or you're with people or stuff like that. When you're on a train, because you have that security of like, I'm on a railroad, there are no other turns this can take me, because things can still go wrong, of course, but that power is just like, it's like being on a bus or something where I just have to sit and just enjoy the journey at this point. it really lets me sink in the scenery and that idea of connecting different places that are seemingly would never be able to be together. And I think that's maybe from like focusing back on the historical aspect. That's where I feel like railroads, goodness me, are really important because the idea of not just transporting people, but being able to transport large quantities of goods changed everything.
Oh, absolutely. Like that's honestly more my experience with trains. Is their use their more utility as opposed to their human, you know, cargo, because I'm gonna have to explain fucking Fort Wayne geography to you. It's gonna be weird. So
Let's do it.
Fort Wayne is a city in the middle of Indiana, and we're really nicely centrally located. But also, it's a city that's like kind of expanding. It's the second biggest city in Indiana, and so like we're kind of eating other cities. And so, even though I live in Fort Wayne, like certain shady websites will often tell me that there are attractive singles also in New Haven. Because New Haven's also a city in Indiana that's literally just a part of Fort Wayne at this point. It's like there's very little discernible difference between the line between Fort Wayne and New Haven. Yet they have their own city council, they have their own mayor. It doesn't make any sense. There's no countryside anymore between Fort Wayne and New Haven. The neighborhoods, the suburbs are just expanding out, and at a certain point, someone's going to have half their house in New Haven and half their house in Fort Wayne. It's going to be hilarious. Anyway, New Haven is a city completely built around trains and shipping. And it's fucking terrible city design. The city planning there is terrible because they laid down the tracks and then they built a city around the tracks. It quite literally what happened. And so like it kind of drives me crazy whenever I have to go to New Haven because there'll be like a light for an intersection. There'll be a traffic light, and in the middle of the intersection you'll have to like kind of veer off to the right or to the left and go over some train tracks because the intersection's built around train tracks. And so instead of going straight through the light, you're like make it a little S turn. It's so fucking annoying. But yeah, I'm used to trains more for the utility freight. Something I'm very used to is just seeing them kind of go by or having to wait on a train in traffic because they're moving a bunch of things, and it's just cart after cart, and you see the trailers on them. You see, of course, the graffiti on them and stuff, which is something I've always kind of felt was really cool. Yeah, so that's more my experience with trains, is just their ability to move cargo.
That's interesting. I've kind of been... Lincoln's a little bit like that. Coventry certainly wasn't, which is where I'm actually from, and then Lincoln's where I study. Lincoln is near like a big river, but there's also one direct train line running through it. And how it's built, it like runs through the entire city. So it's like a direct straight line down the middle of the high street with a train going through it, which I'm like, okay. So there's specifically like built bridges that's part of the architecture where you have to walk it over the trains because there are ones that are constantly coming back and forth. And that's where I get to see more of that, like a lot of the cargo and stuff like that. And I always think those are interesting because just the design of like a train as well, like the classic steam tram and such like that, I think are like very like comforting images, and like obviously outdated by now, but there is like a kind of like novelty and there's cool like design with like the steam coming out of a train as it goes down. But when you get to like the big freighter trains, those things are terrifying to me, especially when they're moving fast. I don't know, man. You can get separated from like a plane because it's going in the air and it kind of always looks slow, and you'll never be in a position unless your name's Clark Kent to actually see how fast the plane moves up close. But when you're near a railroad, and a train comes bouncing down, and it's got like this really heavy, like super backed up, countless weights of steel. I don't know how much it would tie them up together, and it's moving at that speed with that level of force. That is like a sight to me. I can't even really comprehend. Like, if that hit something, what would it do to it?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that is, you don't normally get to see power of that scale in regular life, and I think that's an interesting part of trains.
Cool. Yeah, I don't know. They're interesting to be around. Most of my train interactions are just, God fucking damn it, I'm gonna be late.
That's some of mine as well, but I'm also good at saying, well, fuck it, I'm late then. Just chilling out and enjoying it.
It's just, it's such a pain in the ass. Like, what really annoys me is when you're waiting on a train and, like, then it stops and it'll start, like, backing up. And I'm just like, really? Is here the spot to do this?
Sometimes you just gotta back up, bro.
Yeah, I guess. Alrighty. Go ahead and go on to my next one. After our conversation, I really probably should have switched this, but again, this is a very personal list. So my next bit on the list is film. I think film is a very important, very interesting, and almost a bit of a creepy jump in technology, but it's also like maybe my favorite. Because with film, you get, obviously movies, television, animation as an offshoot of film. It's all just really, really interesting to me. And I think it's like, it's almost a... I hesitate to say something like this, but like, film is something that has had such a profound impact on arts that it's hard for me not to say it's like the best art form, because everything is kind of a reaction to film when you get right down to it at this point. Like, when movies were first started, the people on even the lower realms of theater, like on fucking vaudeville performances, were like, oh, real actors don't do pictures. Those aren't really the art form. And now it's come so far that, like, when you write a play or a musical, you're having to do a lot more to justify it being a play or a musical as opposed to just a short film or just a low budget film. There's very, like, stage has had to justify itself in the face of film. Literature has, like, everything now is in a lot of ways reactionary to film. It's not that they're trying to prove that they're better, that they're not as, or that they're just as good as film or anything. It's just pacing in novels has gotten better because of film. I truly believe that. Video games try to be more like film. The comic books try to be more like film. Everything's just kind of revolves around that artistically nowadays. And so you just... The few things that don't, like two-dimensional painting, art, or sculpture, have really begun to feel very outdated. And it's like, it's been a long time since I feel sculpture has really captured the public zeitgeist, unless you count, like, the discussion on should we tear down, Confederate monuments in this country. It seems to have had such a radical effect on aesthetics that it's really, really fascinating.
Yeah, and I think maybe part of where that fascination to this day still continues and is still being changed and innovated, it really does come down to it's the closest to being able to capture, I won't even say like imagination, but the reality of life with all, I guess someone's always said this, but like with all the boring bits taken out.
Mm-hmm.
You can you can take a photo, you can take a bunch of photos, and they can bring you back memories. You can look at a painting, and it can take you to worlds you've never been before. It can give you like a design of like something like the Mona Lisa, where it's just like so unique and so of itself in terms of what it's trying to capture and such like that. Or you can read a novel, and all of it can be formed by specifically you, and all of it's very personal, and all of them are very valid. And even music as well can do the same things now and again. Um, but with film, you do kind of get that, especially with how we have film now, where it is really all of those film things in once. It really does kind of feel like the Silver Age Superman of the genre, where it's like, oh yeah, so yeah, books, you're the Flash, and you're the best thing around, but I can also just be just as good as you and do what you want to do because I have scripts, which can basically just be books that I get to add pictures to as music to convey things that might have been lost otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
There are obviously the strengths and weaknesses to that, but I definitely can see that film will continue to be, given the fact that you can actually get people to act in it, living flesh, in a way that you can't unless you're a murderer with sculptures. So like, I think that kind of captures some of what maybe makes it feel a little bit more, I won't even say important, but I think what makes the general public so more fascinated with it, because it can, if you just suspend your
Suspension of disbelief. There you go.
Yes, there we go. Thank you. You just do this. This is why we don't do audiobooks as one of the categories. But we just do that just a little bit with film, and you can just imagine that this is something that's happening, or you're there, or in a way that you kind of don't have to invest yourself as heavily with the other medias to get to that point, because you're seeing it happen physically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like that's the thing is, I was tempted to put the caveat of like it's kind of the ultimate art form amongst the visual arts, but like even then, music, it's once we started getting clever with music videos, they became a bigger deal. Like I feel like music kind of took off in a number of ways with that. Even now, there's like, if you go to a rock concert, they put on like light shows and stuff. If you go to a classical music concert, they'll broadcast something, because film has kind of spoiled us to where it's not that we can't just listen to a piece, but it's like seeing film has made us need, or has spoiled us where we almost need to have a visual accompaniment to something, you know? And it's just, I don't know, it's really, really interesting just how, again, I really like it because it's a form of mass media that has introduced so much to everybody. I really like for the people art advancements in art forms. Like sculpture is really, really fascinating. There's an argument that sculpture is the most technically demanding art form, because like with a painting, you only have to make sure it looks good from, relatively speaking, about 180 degrees. But really, you're meant to look at it head on. With the sculpture, it needs to be perfect from 360 degrees. So there's an interesting argument to be made there, but it's also like, most people don't get the chance to truly see a sculpture in that format. And even when you do, you're also not allowed to touch it, which I feel kind of ruins part of the craft, because part of what's fascinating about them is to be able to reach out and kind of feel it. Whereas film, it's got such an accessibility to it. There's such just a raw, like, it's cheap. It is really a cheap medium for people to experience and also for people to use, especially now. and that just makes it really, really fascinating. And because of the amount of precision that you're able to create in film through editing, it enables the art form to be more and more impressive. You look at films from like the 60s and 70s, and the shot composition and everything is great. There's no denying it. But like, since then, we've gotten better at developing like raw film and also working through the methods of film and things that are quite literally not film, digital photography. That now there's like color grading and really fascinating things you can do to just, you can make entire sequences look like these beautiful paintings, and you can do just crazy things on film with them. It's really, really interesting.
And I think one of the interesting things about that, specifically as you mentioned, just kind of brought to my mind the idea of you can't touch a sculpture and you can't take it home with you to appreciate and stuff like that. Film really is unique in the sense where there's almost two lives to it. If you get to see a film at the pictures and cinemas, you get to have that experience of being in a big screen where it's like an event, right? As you go out to it and you say, okay, that's what we're doing for the day. You can normally say, oh, we're going to go to a art museum for the day, or we're going but you don't really say, I'm going to listen to music for the day. Let's all go out and do it. You can do a concert, sure, and there are exceptions to that, but like when you're at home, that's just how society has evolved, with film being so cheaply accessible. Cheap is a strong word when you look at the food prices, but
okay, Jerry.
That costs more than the plane ticket, the sword, and the railway. But you get once you get to that part, it's like that event, right? You get that buzz, and you get to have that film in the way it's mostly intended to on a specific screen. Then, if you're so inclined, you can now buy that film, take it home with you, and have it to yourself. And if you really liked it, and you really want to appreciate the craft of a film you're really passionate about, you can watch it multiple times, you can pause frames, you can go back, you can rewind, you can do fan edits, you can change stuff, you can make it your own, you can do all these different stuff. You can go see the sequel and you like the original better because of these things, and it's informing the sequel. You get art pieces which are meant to be like spiritual sequels or like in the same series by the same artist, but very rarely do you get a actual sequel in that sense. Obviously you get books and stuff, but I think it's one of those other things where go to the Silver Age Superman example, where film kind of gets every other extra thing every other art form thought it had to itself as a strength, and there's not really one I can imagine where it doesn't have. Even the idea of, okay, well, a book you get transported into your own mind and it's your own imagination that fills a lot of the blanks. I think all of us, if you're listening to Geeky Gentlemen, have been in an argument with someone who's seen the same film with you and walked away with a completely different version of it in their head. Mm-hmm. So even that, I think, is captured in film, and it's, again, probably not just the most easily accessible piece of media we have and the most commercialized, and that and video games are the ones that are making the most profit at the moment. But it's just one of the ones that probably deservedly does deserve to have the level of access it has reached.
Yeah, I absolutely think so. Alright, what's your next one?
My next one kind of ties into the film, but with this, it's the downgrade of the film. It's the camera. And the camera, I think, a lot of it won't be repeating because we didn't really get into the technical aspect of film, but the idea of the camera, of being able to capture a moment in time, is crazy to me. Mm-hmm. That is insane. that we figured out how to do that as a society, as a culture, as a humanity being zeitgeist. That is just, how did we do that? What made us get to that point, from the point of when we're drawing things to capture it to the point now we now physically can have moments in time on your pocket, whip it out on a smartphone, and oh, look at all these time bubbles we have. Like, it's crazy shit, right? I'm not the only one who thinks that.
I think most of the technologies on here, let me just review my list real quick. -1. Or even then, maybe not. No, because that could be considered talking to demons. Yeah, every technology I have on here is something that is just straight up witchcraft. Like that, just you take this back to a time before it existed, you get around the wrong crowd, and you will be burned alive as a witch if you showed it to them. Because it is just, it's something that you, when you really think about it, it's super fucking weird that we can do it. And yeah, I agree. Photography, cameras, it's fucking weird. Like, it's just, it's unnerving in a way. That, like, we talk about all the benefits of the art form of film, but, like, the predecessor to that of photography, of photographing reality, it's kind of weird. It's got this very otherworldly feeling to it. You ever... Because, like, you've obviously got mirrors, you've got reflections, but I think everyone's kind of had this feeling of, like, seeing a picture of themselves, and it's got this kind of, like, oh... feeling to it. This that's what I look like. There's this revealing nature to it that, like, because when you're looking in a mirror, you're seeing a distortion, whereas when you're looking at a photograph, that's how others see you. And there's something very, like, kind of disturbing about it in a way.
Like, inherently unnatural.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's something the human brain was not meant to see.
Yeah.
Which I think that comes up with. It's like you get people who have a lot of fears of, like, heights and stuff like that, and all of that is understandable. It kind of ties in with our other mentions on the list. I'm sure a lot of people are shit terrified of getting stabbed with a sword, but all of that comes from worldly things, right? Like, even something that we aspire to in flight. That's a natural inclination that other beings are hardwired that eventually achieve it. But the idea of being able to capture a moment and then look back on it with pinpoint detail is just, no, that's not meant to be.
Yeah, there's, like, a creepy side to it, but it's also, like, just this incredibly useful thing, because now there's just this idea of photographic evidence of things that just didn't exist before, and it's becoming, obviously, you know, very, very pronounced, as everyone's got a camera on them now. You know, it's weird that we can now prove things that at a time just could never be. It always would have just been one person's word against another's, you know?
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people, the example they go to is superheroes can't happen anymore because nowadays one kid with a smartphone is going to see Peter Parker rip off his mask. It's just so much of the world has been opened up and almost in a way ruined in some senses, in terms of, like, the little corners of the world that maybe this creature out there exists. If you just took this blurry photo of it, especially as cameras have improved, nearly every single myth of the world has been debunked, because now we get to people who are there to take a high quality photo of it. Like, no, it's not. It was a dog.
Like, I prefer Mitch Hedberg's take on it. I think Bigfoot is just blurry. It's not the photographer's fault. I miss Mitch Hedberg. Hey kids, apparently heroin's bad for you. Don't do it. Okay, sorry, go on.
And that's basically what I was going for, with the idea of that level of changing how the world's perspective is. If, for example, the printing press gave everyone the language barrier, if everyone in the world suddenly got the same mouth, camera gave everyone in the world the same eyes, and now we're like this, in the same way Grant Morrison has kind of an interesting take of just like how humans are connected. Like everyone goes into their mother and back and forth endlessly, right? We're all from this one single cell that divided. Photography is a way of kind of giving us that in specifically, okay, now everyone can see what we see. But also detaching it from just scientific photography, where it's the capturing a moment as precisely as you can to log it and file it away for history. When you get into artistic photography, anyone who's interested in this, please go and follow at Jonathan Bell, Superman himself. Absolutely mind-blowing stuff, and just talking to him occasionally has made me appreciate photography a lot more from what he's told me. But when people use the editing of photography, or even before they had editing, when they just time the perfect shot, that is, we talk about it being witchcraft, well, that is just magic.
Yeah, like what's really fascinating about that is, you know, you think of Photoshop today as like this new modern invention, but like people have been doctoring photos since almost the invention of photography. You can see some really like weird, almost macabre, old-timey photographs that are really fucking fascinating. Like almost immediately people started like playing with things like shutter speed and stuff to doctor how a photo would look when it was finalized. And so there's like images of people like holding their own head kind of thing, just like this really classic photography, and it's just almost immediately people started fucking with it to make creepy shit.
Nothing's changed.
right. And of course film is you know, kind of an accident of photography. I don't know if this is just a rumor, or if this is just one of those like historical factoids that's like wrong or what, but if I'm remembering correctly, film was invented from photography as a way to win a bet, because horses run too fast for human perception to be able to like keep up with their feet, and so there was a debate about whether a horse at a full gallop ever had a point where it didn't have a foot on the ground, and there's no way to physically tell with human eyes in a reliable fashion, so someone invented a camera that could take pictures really fast to be able to see that happen, and that's how you got film. And it's just
crazy.
Yeah, isn't that weird? Like it's a, you know, accident.
This is why you need to debate me, bro. We'll make science.
Right. Oh, shit's fascinating. Shit is absolutely fascinating. All right, I'm gonna go on to my next one then. It's both a blessing and a curse, and that is the internet. Is my number 2. It's one of those things where, again, a lot of mine just have this very consistent theme of something's introduced and it's a product for the masses. That is something I find just infinitely fascinating. And so for all the good and bad that it's done, the internet is something that I think is truly a net gain for humanity, believe it or not, because of just the amount of doors it opens, the amount of possibilities it creates, the amount of connections and things that this direct networking ability has amongst people is something that's really interesting. And I think it is, not always, but in some ways, I think it's like slowly leading to people just becoming more accustomed to each other, becoming more more connected in more deeply personal ways, because when Steve was here, he and I talked about this a bit, about how like personal relationships have changed because of the internet, because long distance friendships, relationships, what have you, there are always things that existed. Like pen pals were always a thing, but I hesitate that most people would call their pen pal a friend back in the day, because it was so infrequent. You could only get so much information. You could only be so personally connected to someone. And even when we had, just phone, just long distance conversation, there was obviously a huge financial cost associated with it, but it's just, you had to be devoted to just the phone line. Whereas once you got internet, it's coupled with personal computers and smartphones, and then there's this very personal, you're kind of always around it, you're always near it, and so you always have that ability to constantly be in touch with someone. And for as much as like I value personal friendship and stuff, I think a lot of friendship is just based off who you're stuck with or who you're around the most. And so I think that like the internet has allowed people in both positive and negative ways to tailor the people that they just by necessity are around the most, because you tailor your social communities online. And I don't know, it's something that I find really, really fascinating, because it's not always for the best, but it is building connections between people. And I think it's also making us see each other as human a lot more. I think since the invention of the internet, there's less of a trend to otherize. There's less of a trend to not see someone as a person, not see someone as less than. That's not a universal. There's definitely cases where you can find people who put down or otherize people online, but it's just I feel like that by necessity is becoming less true.
And I think the key example to that is very much to the idea of when you're at home or when you're in prior internet. You are around people who just happen to be born in your location, so that's fitting the heart there. And then you gravitate towards people who have your interests or likes and dislikes, or just may not have the same likes and dislikes, but are disliked by the same people that you're disliked by, so then you gravitate towards that and form that clique, or that example kind of idea. And that's how social groups used to work, and they still very much do, especially when you're young. Because the internet was be friendly for that and such, but at the end of the day, when you are forced to go to school and stuff like that, that is when you still do that connecting. That's just how the human brain works in that sense. Once you do go onto the internet and you have that as your only basis to build connections, doesn't matter what sexuality you are, doesn't matter what you look like or what you sound like or anything, because the moment you hit that web, you are anonymous. If you really want to be, you are completely anonymous. Now, when you personalize stuff on social media sets and you do put a presentation of yourself out there, you are technically still anonymous, because people will know the side of yourself that you present, right? But mostly, that will be something, if you're like an honest person, that will be something you'll want to connect to people, so you'll say your interests and your likes and dislikes and such and such and such. And gradually but surely, if you do it right, or if you do it in a way where you're open and presentable to people, pestering, you will build a following, be it 50, 30, 100 or more so. It just depends on the person. But that is a way where you build up those communities and connections in a much healthier and you choosing way than you ever could without it. because when you go into, oh, I hear there's a comic book club, I'm gonna go there because I like comic books. You don't get to choose which people in that club you can block.
Right? Right?
Like, if David over there wants to say some racist shit, you can't kick him out of the club unless you own the club.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Like, as much as I like the atmosphere of, like, the comic book store thing, you know, I've been in there, and then there's the one guy who just won't shut up about that one particular hot take he has until everyone acknowledges him and bows to his rightness. And that can get really fucking old, whereas I meet those guys on Twitter, and I either mute, block, or just go, I register the profile name and the picture in my head and go, okay, I'm never going to read an opinion from them again. Like, I can filter it in a way that I can't when I'm at the comic shop, you know?
Mm-hmm. And that's something that's completely unique to the internet. Now we've mentioned the negatives of that, and that obviously brings towards it the growing, I guess, kind of like bad side of the internet, where that anonymity has led people to be able to form hate groups in a way, in a comfortable environment than they would have before. Because how society as a whole viewed character groups. Obviously, the Ku Klux Klan got to be able to try and familiarize their image when they came back, and like with a vengeance. But at the end of the day, things got pulled off. Things got disproved eventually, and the same with the Nazi Party. People can't outright call themselves Nazis, even though they really want to, without having to deal with that in like a public sense. And because of the internet, they've claimed to be able to do it in out and about public. With the stuff like 4chan, and even some parts of like Reddit, being able to be free from scrutiny to form connections is really fucking dangerous, and it's led to a lot of bad shit. I don't think that can be understated, and I think us being able to talk about that and admit that fault is necessary when we're actually praising the internet, because once you do accept that, you can also respond as the way the internet is built is, if it really wanted to, it can shut that shit down real quick. So the product and invention itself doesn't inherently necessitate that. It's just how it's being run that causes the bad parts to exist, right? Because the internet of itself, of just being able to connect around the world in that form, I think is universally positive in its idea and its conception.
Yeah, I think I mean, you could say that about a lot of things, but
Sure.
I think it's something that anything that builds connections towards people, I'm generally in favor of, and it's just, without the internet, you wouldn't have certain things as they are, and I don't know, it's anything with a mass appeal has problems, and I'll admit that for all these things that are on my list. You know, you've got the printing press is a fantastic invention, but it also allowed things like Mein Kampf to be distributed among the masses. The film is a great medium, but it also enables a centralized and very archaic system, and that's why you have stuff like whitewashing and like cultural appropriation take off as much as it is. There's negative sides to all of these. The internet probably has the most apparently negative side to it. That's all well and good, but I think when you look at what it does well, the things, the kind of connections, the kind of communities that it creates, for positive, I think the positive that it creates outweighs any of the negatives in a lot of ways. Like, every day I feel like I see someone on Twitter, oh, welcome back to this hell site. I'm like, you know what? It's just people. You just have a problem with people, because there are shitty people in the world. I'm sorry, it sucks, believe me, I know. But, like, it's not Twitter itself that's the problem. Could they do things to make those shitty people less popular? Yes, certainly, and you can criticize the way it's managed for that, but like, end of the day, it's what you're complaining about is the way people deal with each other. But I think there is something, even when it's at its worst, there's something genuinely positive to those connections, even the connections that are harmful, even the connections that are toxic. I think there's an underlying positive to them in that it is connecting people, and it's allowing people to see sides of others that they might not otherwise, which is weird. So like, this is kind of a weird utilitarian thing, but I think it's not something I even necessarily wholeheartedly agree with, but I think it's an interesting thing to at least consider, which is, yeah, racists and sexists and just sons of bitches online are really fucking annoying, but like, I think there's something positive to seeing that behavior out in the open, because it can allow people to confirm that it exists in a genuine way that doesn't feel packaged, you know?
Yeah, it's like that excuse of, wow, none of my friends I've seen say that, so does the problem really exist you're talking about?
Yeah, there's something useful to being able to screenshot or quote tweet racist bullshit. Because, like, it's there, it's being said, it's what these people think. Like, you're seeing someone's thoughts. They took the time to write it down. That's what they believe, and they posted it out into the world, and you're getting the chance to see that. And so, while it might hurt someone, definitely, like, language hurts, not gonna lie, while those things being put out into the world might hurt some, I think there's something, especially when it's exposed, when it's put on display and framed to be the negative that it is, I think it gives the opportunity for others to grow. As weird as that might sound, I don't know. I'm not going to say I 100% agree with that, and certainly Twitter and Facebook and YouTube could do a better job about, not platforming hate speech. But there's, even at its worst, I think there's positives to take from it, is kind of what I'm trying to get at.
I think a good example is everything else we've listed. You put a Nazi in the plane and they're bombing you. You got no control of that. The Nazis control the railroad. You got no control of that. Nazis got a sword on you. Wow, you better hope to God you're fast at running, kind of thing. Nazis got the internet. So do you. You can be that fucker. It's the one tool that is, if you're on it, everyone has, obviously people have more followers and stuff, but even then, people with hundreds of thousands of followers get taken down all the time by a 40 anime avatar. Like, it's kind of crazy. I think the internet is probably one of the biggest examples, and as much as people do want to ride down on like cancel culture like it's its worst idea, there has been a lot of good done by that. Mm-hmm. Specifically when it hasn't been framed by like the right-wing media as, no one can say anything these days. It's like, no, you just can't say racist shit, because now people are smart enough to call up on you. No matter how big you are, you can't be unfazed by it. So yeah, I think you're 100% right. Even when it's at its worst, because everyone mostly has it, given the way that it's kind of a necessity at this point, especially depending on what you do for your work, everyone has also the exact same tools and the exact same language where they can fight that negativity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's kind of what I tend to think on it. It's a very interesting. It's a hydra. There's definitely some sides to it that are just fucking awful. Like child pornography rings, I don't think were a thing before the internet, at least not to the extent that they are now. But it's definitely got those like, wow, that's really fucked up. But again, those are all like reflections of people. I don't think it's the thing itself. I think the thing itself is a net positive. So that's why I put it up so high. What's your number two, Alfie?
Well, the internet was actually my number two as well.
Oh, interesting.
So we talked about that for for a good bit there. So I'm just gonna go for my number one, which is kind of it's interesting how this has kind of worked out. I feel like we somewhat thematically laid these out without intending to. My number one is the pen, the mightier than the sword.
Mm.
I went with the pen because I think like that's just the idea of, and again, the pen in the broad term, mainly the idea of putting words to sight and forming language, being able to learn from that, being able to learn reading, being able to write art, being able to write down science, being able to write anything and having that power. And then, in a way, directly leading to every single one of the other things we've mentioned on this list of how that gets passed down and how that gets communicated, or just the idea of making a note of something when you're working on yourself that no one else has to see, is that, I think, is probably the most interesting to me of something we've created that has fundamentally changed what the human experience is. The idea of writing, and because again, it's not specifically language, because animals have languages, dolphins particularly, or even elephants. Like, that exists. Before even things were put to paper, language was pressed on. But the idea of being able to preserve that and being able to pass that on and then being able to read someone else's words after they've long died, that's just got some real fucking power to it.
Mm-hmm. No, you're absolutely right. The invention of language, the invention of the written word it's just incredibly important because, yeah, I mean, we were having it kind of before we started recording where I was like, oh, I thought of something and I completely forgot, and it took me a couple of minutes to get back to it. And it's that idea of, like, not having to rediscover a thing because you've written it down, not having to commit something to memory because it's written down and you can reference it later. It's just really, really fucking important because it allows you to not be cluttered in your thinking. It allows you to spend mental resources on the things that actually require your thought as opposed to things that you've already figured out, you know? I think that's a very, very important and very distinguished piece of technology is just the ability to write things down. Yeah, it sounds silly to talk about it when earlier we were talking about jet planes and trains and shit, but like, no, it's a big fucking deal. It's such a very simple but very, very profoundly important thing. We started off History Month by talking about archaeology and how one of the things that's like so disappointing is how much stuff just is lost forever because it was probably never written down, you know?
And that's thankful for what has been. And again, to that effect, something I am eternally fascinated by and will never understand, but I'm so thankful there are geniuses in this world who do understand this and have been able to make this a thing. But the idea that someone from a different time, from a different country, speaking an entirely different language, can write a story, and with the way they did strokes on the pen through that page, I now, through a translation of someone who wrote those pens in a different way, who understood how that correlated to that, can interpret those into a sensible story and get as accurate as he can. And now in 2019, I can read Journey to the West whenever I want. It's fucking crazy, man. Like, you don't understand how much that blows my mind. Like, we managed to make that happen. Like, again, the picture kind of gets into that kind of time capsule sense. But even more so, I feel like there's a certain... If you find old written down like my partner Sarah, she recently found some of her grandfathers and great grandfathers like letters to home during the war and stuff, just being able to see that stuff. And when someone's got handwriting, and I know for one, my handwriting's messy as anything, so I understand how thousands of years down the line, no one's going to know what I was talking about. They were going to think I'm kind of some Greek sage born in the wrong time. So I understand, like, the intricacies and the personality when someone writes something, especially when you get a good writer, and how that can be preserved through so many years. And like, you look at Shakespeare and how everything's being influenced and everything's comparing itself to Shakespeare, and he didn't even know how to write properly. But he just he the ideas and the way he captured them onto the page, even if it wasn't meant for the medium of books, it was doing plays, but because it's been able to be translated through that lens, and those ideas are so strong and so primordial of that basic concept, oh, this dude had a really killer idea, let's still do it. It's something that exists to this day, and I think is a very healthy, beautiful thing when you get that collaboration. The fact that you can do that with people who died hundreds of years ago, who would never know about you or anything like that, is one of the most like inspiring and beautiful things about human history to me. For like History Month, this whole thing, I've learned a lot about what you've told me, from be it archaeology to different characters and such like that. But this specifically, the idea of literature being passed down and intent of ideas being able to be interpreted in different ways and such like again, how many different myths about dragons are there in the world that these cultures had no way to be able to do them at the same time? And now that that's evolved to the point now, whenever someone makes a dragon, they have to, oh, are we doing an Eastern dragon or a Western dragon? But should we just combine both and make one mix and matches? Stuff like that. Again, little examples form a bigger whole in my mind. That is just like, that's my epitome of, okay, if we can get this done, maybe humanity is not all bad.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's really fascinating. That is it's a really cool one, Alfie. That's kind of all I got for you. It's a really cool, very niche, kind of like subversive pick. I like it. It's a good one.
There we go. I mean, I was also trying to be. I wanted to just get the pen, mighty, and the sword in there somewhere. Like, come on, man. I set that one up.
Nice. All right, I'm gonna go for my number one then.
Shoot.
Fire.
Well,
Fire good.
Fire good. I didn't know. I was talking to. Oh my god.
Fire good.
I can't believe I'm just blanking on this name right now. But you flew too close to the sun, mister.
Oh, Icarus.
Yes, Icarus. There we go. I was about to say Hermes and look stupid.
No, Icarus had nothing to do with fire. Icarus flew too close to the sun. It had nothing to do with fire. Yeah, fire. No, I mean, like, I'm congratulating you for your subversive pick, because I didn't expect you to do what I was planning to do with my number one, which was go for a subversive pick like fire. No, but like, seriously, fire good, because it is literally like the symbol of technology.
Oh
yeah. The Greek myth of what's his name? Oh shit! It starts with a P. His soul fire from the gods gave it to man. Eagle eats his liver every day.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
That's why I thought it was Icarus.
Prometheus.
There we go.
Yeah, Prometheus. You know, the myth of fire, the myth of Prometheus is you got Prometheus and his brother given the parts of life by Zeus. Wrap your head around that one. And they're meant to use them to create life for the earth, and Prometheus's brother uses all the good parts on animals, so he makes them faster and stronger and able to survive in the wilderness of the earth and everything. He uses all the good parts, and all that Prometheus is left with is the shitty stuff humans are made of, and we are kind of like one of the most pathetic animals on the planet. When you get right down to it,
we're squishy.
We're squishy. It takes us several years after birth before we're able to do anything on our own. We're so dependent. There's just if if you were to rank species purely on physical abilities and survivability based solely on physical capabilities, humans are shit. We suck. We would be like,
Glad to see Ian's propelling his furry agenda.
yeah, we'd be really low on the list. And so like the Prometheus myth is such just like this important idea of like, but he stole fire from the gods and taught man how to make it. And it really is the basis of all technology, because what you need is you need the ability to have, you know, that security, that warmth, that ability to survive the night when it's at its worst. And so from fire, like on its own, you begin to get things like shelter, so you don't have to depend so much on it. And then you get things like tools, because you don't have to spend as much time dealing with things, because you've got those built-in parts of security. You've got this. Once you have shelter, you're not doing as much movement. You've got a less wide stance in your movement. And of course, all of this is like very idealized, but there's something to it that feels so like fundamentally true. Like kind of the iconic imagination of fire was like one night a group of proto-humans just happened to be absolutely miserable in the wilderness on like an awful storm, and lightning struck a tree branch and caught it on fire. And for just this one time, something happened, something changed, and instead of running from it like every other animal does with fire, this one person got closer. This one proto-human got closer. And that's probably not even the case. It's probably not even that. It's probably like something ridiculously stupid, like maybe they just got knocked the fuck out and they happened to not die while next to a fire, and then it became a huge superstitious thing that they always had to do it whenever there was a storm, is sleep near the fire, and then it became, you know, ingrained in that group, that tribe, that nomad group. Like, who the fuck knows what it is? But there's like this undeniable thing of we're the only ones that don't run from it when it comes right down to it. Every civilization knows how to make fire. Even the most remote tribes in the world that barely have any contact with the outside world, they know how to do fire. And that's really, really fascinating, because, you know, chimps are a really fascinating land-based species. They make tools. Chimps will hunt with spears. It's really interesting. They don't make fires. We're the only species that ever did it, and that's just really fucking weird.
Mm-hmm. It's also, again, you look at like the deeper meanings of everything, and there's no better element to symbolize imagination, right? And like the invention, because the whole time we've been talking about everything on this list, and every single one we've mentioned has had that element of it can keep you warm, it can keep you safe, but don't put your head in it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of, fire symbolizes that, again, the spark of imagination, and then sets it off, and you can add sticks to it, and it can grow bigger, and it can grow bigger, but if you keep putting too much onto it unwieldy, it will overturn and burn everything around you. It's the all light giver, but it's also the most destructive force on the planet. I don't even need to say much more. Anyone who sees a fire knows its intrinsic beauty, but also its intrinsic terror and like the danger of it. Nobody thinks a fire isn't dangerous, but they still don't fear it. Which is, I mean, obviously some people do, and some people really like fire. You got like arsonists, but there's that primal understanding with fire, I feel like, which doesn't exist for any other element the world around that humans interact with. So I definitely feel like some of the stuff you just said on the top of your head, probably all those stories happened. I'm sure, given how many cultures and how many people in the world, I'm sure it wasn't just one isolated event. I'm pretty sure every single time someone imagines how fire was made, that probably happened to one tribe, and it just all came together for how humans are wired, or for some reason we've just got that curiosity in us where we're gonna risk it. We're gonna. This might kill us, but you know what? One of us has to see what it is. Let's see what it is, and then the course of humanity changes from that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a very important distinction. Definitely a strong one to end on.
Yeah, just because it's one of those things we kind of talked about it early in History Month where I'm like, I'm not sure about everything. Some of this is just, kind of conjecture and stuff you just pick up. Just because I'm pretty sure that humans are the only ones that discover fire, make fire. Apparently there's, reports, no photographic evidence of it, but reports that there's a bird that will, take little burning twigs and stuff from brush fires and then drop them in fields in order to hunt. Don't know if I'd 100% count that, but
Yeah,
it is
it's a much
interesting.
different relationship to it.
Yeah, I mean, but it's interesting. I don't want to, tool use is really cool when you see animals do it. It's really fascinating. But I'd consider that tool use. I think the distinction that's really important about humans is there's always that idea of oh, at first, I think most people, when they imagine the discovery of fire, most people imagine, okay, well, it's probably lightning strike or some kind of natural occurrence of combustion that some proto-humans took advantage of. But what's really, again, particular about humanity is we went from taking advantage of that to, maintaining it. So it wasn't just a one-off. We found ways to maintain fire, and then we found ways to create it. And that's really, really important. It is literally that spark to creation, that spark to invention, to problem solving. And fire is, for very good reason, kind of the base technology. Everything else is kind of just based around that, in one way or another. It feels everything. Like I was talking about with film is such an innovation because now all art forms are a reaction to it. Well, fire was such an innovation that all of society is a reaction to it.
All of humanity is a reaction to fire.
Right? There's arguments that the first proper societies or the first proper functioning tribes that eventually became societies, family tribes were probably more of a thing, and then once a family tribe got too big to sustain itself, people broke off, and that's how the species spread. But fire and the ability to create it and maintain it and stuff like that is a very fundamental part of creating sustainable societies outside of small tribes and family groups. Once you
Will let you conquer different elements.
Mm-hmm. It's just a really interesting ladder that you go down. I don't know. It's really, really fascinating when you think about it in those kind of implications. Fire good.
Fire good. Ugh. Definitely. I guess one interesting one I just want to point out as well. It's one of the only primordial technologies that we still use. No one's using spears to hunt anymore. But most people, even if they don't have one, replicate it or would oh, that looks cool. Of a fire in the house.
I mean, yeah, that's what a furnace is, right?
Yeah, that's exactly.
It's not got the same aesthetic importance, but that's what a furnace does. Is it's just heating your home with fire. Usually, there's I think there's non-gas. I think there's electric furnaces. Question mark. That's an interesting question. But there's a lot of the things, yeah, are still based around it. I don't know if I'd agree that it's the only proto technology because I drove today. I used a wheel.
I mean, that's true.
But it's definitely up there. It is a very important base, and I think it's the symbol of technology for me. And without it, definitely wouldn't be here. I don't know how far we would have gotten out of the nomad stage if we did not have fire.
Oh, I know for 100% everyone in England would be dead. I'm freezing my balls off right now with fire.
Yep. So I'm gonna end that one on just fire good. Fire good. Okay, Alfie. Next month is holiday month, so we need a holiday movie.
Holiday movie?
Or it doesn't have to be a movie. It can be. We need a review topic for holiday month.
Did we? No, we did Klaus, didn't we?
Yeah.
Okay. There's that new one, right? The animated one on Netflix.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, let's do that. I haven't seen that, but people have been talking about it, and I'm like, yeah, sure, why not?
Yeah,
It's recent.
Sure, that works for me. Alrighty. Everyone, thanks very much for watching. Until next time, I'm the Philosopher.
And I'm in Geek for Fun.
And we are your geeky gentlemen. And we will be fire good.